Hi everyone. I had some requests from some students to talk a little bit more in depth about transitions. And so what I'm going to be doing in this slideshow is talking about the major techniques. We're going to look at some examples from Joseph Harris's book, Rewriting, and then I'll do a little bit of sum up. Hopefully this will help you as you're working on your papers. So transition techniques. The goal with a transition is always to demonstrate the logical connections between ideas on both the paragraph and sentence level. This presentation, I'm mostly going to be focusing on how do you transition between paragraphs, because most of you are doing just fine with transitioning between sentences within a paragraph. But what you really want to do is answer the question, why are these ideas in this order? It can be really easy to write a paper in which you have some sense of why these are in order, but it's not always going to be obvious to the reader why you're talking about them in the order you're discussing. So your job is to make the reasoning behind the order visible. So there are three major approaches, three techniques you'll see writers using. They're not distinct techniques all the time. Oftentimes you will see them being used all together, either in the same paragraph, in a sequence, or just depending on what ideas are being connected. So the first thing is to just name the logical relationship between the ideas. If you're talking about cause and effect, sometimes you'll just have them say, this causes that. That's a logical transition. But you'll also see that writers will use echoes of phrases or words that come from previous sections. And those are sometimes just a natural part of writing on one topic, but there will be more subtle points that are echoed through the language. And sometimes those can be through exact words or through synonyms. So you'll want to, if you're worried about repeating yourself too much or using the same word over and over, you can sometimes use synonyms. And we'll look at a couple of examples of this in the examples we're looking at. And then the last thing, and this is what you're probably most used to thinking about when discussing transitions, is linking code words. Just some examples of those are things like words that represent similarity are also, in the same way, likewise, similarly. And then you have all the other logical transitions that you might want to do. This is not a complete list. This is just a very common one. So you might look at exceptions and contrasts. That's where however, but, still, nevertheless. You'll have transitions to lead you into specific examples. You'll have places where you're building emphasis, or you're talking about cause and effect, additional support, repetition, conclusion, summary. All of these are linking, they have common linking code words that signal to readers what the logical transition is that you are discussing. Now, some of these different kinds of words represent stronger logical links than others. An example is a very specific kind of transition and logical link. We're moving from a general principle or claim to something that illustrates that principle or claim. So that's you can't use those kinds of words to transition to something that's not an example. Cause and effect. It's talking about a very specific kind of logical link. If something's not actually causing the thing that comes after it, you can't use those words. But some links, especially things like additional support or exceptions or contrast, get overused by students in places where that's not actually the logical relationship. I'll oftentimes see students using the word however when they're not actually suggesting a contrast or difference. They're just adding on. So that can be a real problem. Especially the idea of similarity or additional support, students will often use those linking words when there should be a stronger logical relationship between those two ideas. So you want to make sure that you're using the most appropriate kind of linking word and getting the most specific kind of logical link between two ideas that you can. So additional support and similarity, they work really well for connecting subpoints or examples together. But if all of your major points transition with also and another, it's likely that you haven't thought about why your points are in the order that they are in enough, and the transitions are too weak as a result. So I want you to pause the video in just a moment and read this section from the introduction of Joseph Harris's book, Rewriting. We read it earlier in the semester, so just take a look and read it through once. And then once you've finished, you can resume the video and we'll walk through some of the transitions we can see here. All right, so let's take a look. The first few sentences here are actually the end of a paragraph, and we can see that the purpose of that paragraph was to define a specific problem or question that academic writers have. Now, Harris had two options here. He could continue to go on and define the problem in more detail, or he could start to answer that question. He has to transition from this paragraph to the next in a way that shows which of those options he's taking. In this case, he's going to start to answer the question, and he transitions by describing what he is doing as advice. And this is an example of that first kind of transition that I mentioned, which is naming the logical relationship between the ideas. Here, the relationship is between problem and solution, or question and answer, right? So it's very specific and letting us know exactly how this next paragraph is following on the paragraph that came before. In the transition to the following paragraph, Harris uses the same kind of technique but combines it with that of the echo technique. Here, his goal is to explain why he's using the word rewriting. He shows the line of thinkers that readers might have. How is rewriting both active and critical? He explains the relationship between what he was talking about before and what he's going to talk about now. He makes this transition not only by explicitly stating that his readers are led to this question by how he describes his advice, but he echoes specific words from the previous paragraph, particularly the language of stance. He isn't repeating himself verbatim, but creating echoes that repeat his ideas with important differences. However, I want you to note that he doesn't stop with just creating an echo of the word stance. He also goes back even further and connects multiple paragraphs in a row together. See, here he goes back to the language of two paragraphs earlier and brings in an echo of what he's been refuting or countering all along. The language of to recite or ventriloquize becomes copying and reciting. So we get that parallelism between those two different pieces. The logic of the argument, the problem, the solution, the choice of language are being put in order and connected through these transitional echoes. We can also see that his transition is multiple sentences. We don't actually start to understand why he's using the word rewriting until almost halfway through this third paragraph, because he's drawing all the pieces of the previous two paragraphs together. However, once he actually launches into his explanation about why he uses the term rewriting, he continues this point for several paragraphs. This means that he also needs a transition from his first reason for why he's using the term rewriting to his second. So I've got that visualized for you here. And now this new transition, rewriting is also a usefully specific and concrete word. That's an example of a linking code word transition, as well as obviously having some echoes. In this case, one of the linking words for telling your reader that you are offering additional support is also. Very straightforward. You guys know this. But this is also one of those transitions that students are most likely to overuse. Notice that here, Harris isn't using it to add a new main point in. This is a subpoint for why he uses the term rewriting to describe the active and critical stance he wants his readers to take. He starts in the previous paragraph by explaining that the term gets at this paradox, and now he's continuing to explain the reasons why this term is such a good one, which is that it's specific, concrete, and an action rather than a feeling or abstract idea. A new subpoint like this still needs its own paragraph, since the previous one was already fairly long and in-depth. And that means he can use the additive transition here because that's what he's doing. If he was moving to a bigger point, rather than continuing to answer the question his readers asked, then he'd probably need a stronger logical connection in his transition. So, to sum up, transitions are hard because, first of all, paragraphs have to be integrated with those around them. They are connected to each other and not just to your thesis. That, in turn, means that your organization needs planning and intentionality. You can't rely on your brain to put things in the right order automatically unless you have a very simple and straightforward topic. Logic is hard, and it's particularly hard because we don't always understand how or why our brains connect the things the way they have. Writing a transition is the process of bringing out that potentially unconscious connection and putting a name to it that other people can understand. You won't be able to successfully transition unless you can do that hard thinking of figuring out, why did my brain connect these things? So if you're having trouble, you may want to consider whether the problem is the placement of the ideas. That is the problem building a connection between these two ideas that you don't know what word to use? Or is it that these ideas don't actually belong next to each other yet? Is there something that's missing to connect them? But it can also be that you just don't have a name for the connection that you're trying to make. Your brain knows these things are connected, but it doesn't know what the connection is. That's where it might be really useful to talk through the idea with a peer or a teacher. So this is all I've got for you right now on transitions. What works for a transition is going to vary from paper to paper, because ideas and the connections between them will vary from paper to paper. So hopefully you'll take this as some encouragement to, if that's something you've been struggling with, to just keep pushing through and use these techniques of trying to build echoes, naming the logic, and using the linking words to help you figure out what you want to connect.